Afternoon, everyone. Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Back home where Bob. It's a pleasure to be here talking with Robert Jahnke, or Bob, better known, about his current work practice and his pieces that we see on display at the moment at the Sydney Contemporary. By way of introduction, I've warned Bob that I think it's appropriate that I give you a little bit of a bio background to Bob and his practice and his standing back home as a senior contemporary Māori artist. So I'm going to do that. Okay, we've got it under control. So Robert Jahnke of Ngāi Taha Rora, Te Whānau a Iritikura, Te Whānau a Rākairoa, and Ngāti Porou tribal descent, was born in 1951 in Waipiro Bay on the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand. Considered one of New Zealand's leading contemporary Māori artists, Robert Jahnke is a highly respected educator, artist, who works as a historian, teacher, researcher, writer, and advocate for Māori and Indigenous arts nationally and internationally. This was acknowledged in 2016 when he was made an Officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit for his services to Māori art and tertiary education. His artistic practice straddles design, illustration, animation, and sculpture, and he works with a range of media, including found objects, steel and lead, and of most recently, neon. Of Samoan, German, Irish, Māori heritage, Professor Jahnke's work is typically based on political issues that face Māori people, the relationship between Māori and Pākehā, which is settler New Zealand, white New Zealander, and the impact of Christianity on Māori culture are explored in various ways in his work and in his research. Robert Jahnke studied for a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Industrial Design in 1975 and then a Master of Fine Arts in Graphic Design, both at Elam Art School at the University of Auckland. Feel free to come in, people. That was then followed by a Master of Experimental Animation at the California Institute of Arts in America in 1980. Upon returning to New Zealand, he taught in Hastings, Rotorua and Auckland before shifting to Palmerston North to join the Massey University staff in 1990, where he launched the Bachelor of Māori Visual Arts program, Toyo Hoki Apiti, in 1995. In 2002, Professor Robert Jahnke was made Chair and Head of School of Te Pūtahi Ātoi, School of Māori Studies, Massey University in Palmerston North. And I suppose in more recent years, he's vacated the head of school role and been able to dedicate more time to his artistic practice and other forms of research, which for us colleagues and researchers in the sector, we've welcomed his voice as an artist and a researcher in more recent years, more avidly and with more focus, which has been exciting. His artwork has been exhibited widely and is included in both public and private collections throughout New Zealand and abroad. His works featured in major group and survey exhibitions of contemporary Māori art in the last 25 years, including Pūrangi Aho, Seen Clearly at the Auckland Art Gallery in 2001, Taiawhio Continuity and Change at the Museum of New Zealand Te Papatungarewa in 2002, and Techno Māori at the Wellington City Art Gallery in 2001. As you can hear, those last survey shows are nearly 25 years ago, or 20 years ago, and it's ominous to know that we are currently planning another contemporary Māori art survey show to update that story in relation to those last shows that we've mentioned. But please welcome me in acknowledging and talking with Robert Jahnke today. So we're not going to say Robert any longer because his name's Bob, and he's known as Bob to all those that he comes into contact with. So kia ora, Bob.
Kia ora.
Good to be here. And as I mentioned, he had an influential leading role in setting up the Toyoho Kiawhiti Bachelor of Māori Visual Arts program in 1995 in Palmerston North. And at that particular time, I believe it was the first Indigenous visual arts degree in the world. So it was quite a unique and pivotal milestone. And Robert Jahnke's program, or Bob Jahnke's program, and the staff that he had worked with him, which were Curator and Shane Cotton, were instrumental in introducing a new generation of young contemporary Māori artists to the fore. And by way of segue to that, I was lucky enough to be one of those young students that was a graduate of the program in 2000. So it's really great to be sitting here on the couch with my old tutor and head of school to talk about his work, not talk about my work, but to talk about his work. And Bob, it's a privilege to be here with you today. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Okay, formalities out of the road. We have a really interesting topic here that we think you're going to find intriguing and perhaps make some parallels to other Indigenous creation narratives and stories that talk about time in a much more philosophic and conceptual way. But our session today is called Rangituhaha, Ascending and Descending Māori Notions of Time. And when we look at Robert Jahnke's latest work, these neon works, From Utter, A Third Reflection, was the name of the exhibition and the body of work that these works come from. We see some really fascinating ponderings, if you like, on this greater idea about Māori narrative and creation stories. So what I'm going to do is firstly ask Bob just to give us a little indication as to what Rangituhaha means to him and that idea and that notion. Kia ora, Bob.
Kia ora. Ko te mea tutahi, ka mihi atu ki ngā tangata whenua o tēnei wahi. Nā te mea, nā rātou e mihi mai kia mātou, kia au, i tēnei wā, ki te haere mai ki te kōrero ki a koutou katoa. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou. I've just begun by saying I really do need to acknowledge the original people of this place, the Indigenous people of this place, who essentially have allowed us to be here today. Just starting with the concept of Rangituhaha, before I begin that, it was interesting the other day in the opening of the exhibition or this fair, that there was a smoke ceremony, and there was an Aboriginal person who came, male who came around and basically almost smoked out the gallery. And it was actually nice because what it does, you know, we have this notion in our culture of Māori, and Māori is it's an invisible, intangible essence that everybody has and that exists in nature, not only within animate but also with inanimate objects as well. So everything is alive for us, you know, everything exists as a living entity, regardless of whether it's animate or inanimate. And so what was nice about that ceremony is the smoke becomes an it impregnates everything that it comes into touch with. And I thought that was an amazingly fitting way of actually opening this fair. And I can still smell it, you know, and it kind of lingers on your clothes. And what it does too, it creates a ethereal patina on all the artworks that are in this particular exhibition. And what I was also fascinated about is that he came in from the outside, and I was just fortunate enough to have a work outside, and that's where the ceremony began. So I'm not saying that I was the favorite, but I was at the entrance with the smoke as it came into this building. And the reason I mention that is because our narratives, or our cosmogenealogical narratives, and notice I say cosmogenealogy as opposed to cosmology or cosmogonic, because genealogy is a really, really important component or part or an essential component of who we are as Māori. And our word for genealogy is whakapapa. And whakapapa means, whaka is to basically layer. Papa is to layer, so it's about putting in order or creating layers of knowledge, layers of learning, layers of connection. And within the context of that, our whakapapa comes from the sky up above, that is Ranginui, and the earth mother below, that is Papa Tuanuku or Papa. So in terms of the Rangituhaha, Ranginui, who is above us, who is the sky, is actually the first of 12 heavens. So in our narratives, we have a staggered system of heavens, and there are 12 of them. And the uppermost heaven is called Te Tiki o Te Rangi. In other words, it's the apex, it is the pinnacle in terms of the heavens that one interfaces with. So Rangituhaha as a word essentially means the be-spaced heavens. And in our narratives of creation, we have a deity called Tāne Nui Arangi. And the reason he's called that is because Tāne climbed the heavens. He ascended to the uppermost heaven. And in our most kind of esoterical narratives, there is a deity that exists in that uppermost heaven whose name is Io, and that's I-O. And basically, this narrative of the journey of Tāne is one that is about climbing the heavens or ascending the heavens, the 12 heavens, to recover the baskets of knowledge, of which there were 3. And he also recovered 2 stones, which also become are necessary in terms of that engagement with knowledge, because it's an intimate part of the wānanga process of learning. And he brings the baskets of knowledge to earth, and they become the knowledge that we engage in our everyday lives as Māori, as people. So Rangituhaha is a very, very important concept. And I think one of the things that I was lucky to do was to come across a process that allowed some reference to this layering, this concept of whakapapa, this concept of Rangituhaha. Not to say that the work that I create is sacred, but it certainly engages with cultural notions that make us as a Māori, as Māori people, identifiable and kind of unique as an Indigenous people. So that's Rangituhaha.
Kia ora, Bob. Okay, we're going to layer another concept on you now. Within the works, Bob, we see the colours blue, we see red, and we see yellow used intermittently in this series. And I know in relation to the Rangituhaha narrative, there's also the creation story, which you mentioned, Ranginui, the Sky Father, and Papa Tuanuku, our Earth Mother, and the embrace that they lay in when we talk about our creation story as Māori people and how we came to be and our place in the world. And just to relay that to you in relation to this, Ranginui, Papa Tuanuku lay in a very tight embrace that did not allow for any light or any movement. So within their embrace lay their children, the different gods, and Tāne being one of them, one of their sons. And they all yearned for a bit more room and a bit more space and a bit more, freedom to move about, because they existed in this very dark, dark space. And that very dark space created by the appearance was called Te Kore, or the Great Nothingness. So within Māori narratives, we start off in this very dark space called Te Kore, the Great Nothingness. And then from different states of Te Kore, we come to a place called Te Pō, the Great Darkness. And then from Te Pō, we emerge into Te Ao Mārama, which is this work here, referencing the world of light and life. And we arrive into this world, Te Ao Mārama, through their son Tāne, who Bob's mentioned, who separates his parents by pushing them upwards and separates them from one another to allow his brothers and the other gods and children of Rangi and Papa to breathe and to occupy the world. And in a nutshell, that's how we come to be here. And this is the world we all live in. We all live in Te Ao Mārama, the world of light and life created by Tāne. So I think, one of the things that fascinates me, Bob, is that for contemporary Māori artists and many Indigenous artists, this use of narratives that are sacredly old, that are time-honoured and enduring, always seem to find new footing and new, they sound anew every time we use them and reference them, not in our works, but in our way of explaining how we come to be. Tell me what interests you in that narrative and why you wanted to explore it in this series of works.
I think it's interesting because if I look back historically at one of my early exhibitions, I was attempting to do exactly the same thing, engage with this concept, but in a different kind of way. And one of the things I was doing was creating sculpture that had voids or that had negative areas. And at that time, I was projecting light onto the voids, and what would happen is through the void, it would create a shape. So I was kind of referencing the notion of Te Kore, or the void, becoming Te Pō, and then becoming Te Ao Mārama, through this juxtaposition of void, light, shadow. And what was interesting at that time is, and interestingly enough, the symbol or the motif that I used was a Doric column. I know it sounds really strange, using a Doric column to kind of create or to interface with these very customary or traditional concepts. But, my early work was also really about addressing, I'll say it to you now because I was more proactively political in the early period, but it was about institutional racism in New Zealand. And one of the ways that I addressed that was taking a motif that is so highly charged in terms of classicism and in terms of the laws that we inherit and in terms of marking places of European significance as opposed to Indigenous significance. But I know that's a little bit of a sidetrack. But one of the things I also do when I'm creating, particularly in this series, this recent series, I wanted to re-engage and to reinvest the work within a cultural paradigm. And obviously, this transition from void or nothingness to Pō, to the darkness, into the light, was one that I wanted to revisit and to express in another way, in a new way. And obviously, when I look at the work, I see the light coming out of the darkness. So I see something coming out of the blackness. I see the future Te Ao Mārama coming from that darkness. That expresses to me the notion of the transition from the void to the night to the light. And metaphorically or allegorically, the whole notion of light is about enlightenment. So we become enlightened in this engagement with culture. And I had to, of course, think about what colors could I use. And of course, Te Kore became red, because the significance of red as a color within Māoridom is that it is the blood of the separation of earth and sky. And interestingly, we as a culture have a notion that for someone to be alive or for someone to exist, you have two elements. You have an element which is called ira atua, and the ira atua is the essential spark of deity. And you also have ira tangata, which is the human essence. And the ira atua, you know, and in a sense, we as people have two elements that keep us alive. One is godly, and the other is human. So we can say that we are also gods. Because actually, when we do depart this world, we lose the ira tangata, but we retain the ira atua. In other words, we become one with the gods again. So that creative process, there's a cycle in terms of that process. And ira tangata, in terms of its origin, comes from the red earth located in the pubic region of Mother Earth. So in order to create a human, Tāne had to get the earth from this area, from this sacred area, and it was only with that that ira tangata came into being. And as I say, I mean, Te Ao Mārama for me is where we exist as people, you know? It's that area. So that became the yellow. Obviously, it's yellow. And so Te Kore becomes invested with the potential, because Te Kore is not a void totally. It's actually the potential for existence. So, you know, it's kind of, yeah, it's kind of a tricky concept, but the essence of being exists within that void. And then out of the night, we get life as we know it when we exist. So, yeah, so it's...
Interesting. I think, I mean, it's fascinating, these philosophies and these concepts, because for me as a young Māori growing up, you try to fathom them and you're trying to make sense of them, and you're trying to make scientific sense of them in your real world. And I suppose that's probably the real flaw there, is to try and make scientific sense of something. However, when we look at Stephen Hawking, you know, Stephen Hawking's claim to fame was actually realizing that that dark matter was actually a very dense matter, and it was actually full of potential. And when we look at Māori creation narratives and stories, Te Kore, this great darkness, this great nothingness, is actually not just nothing. It's actually something full of potential. It's full of the next state of being. And I just find, I found it quite fascinating thinking that science and indigenous cultural narratives have a similar way of meeting in the middle, even though very differently, around how we can understand the world. And I think, you know, Stephen Hawking has earned the privilege of his knowledge being revered as fact. And I think when we look at cultural narrative, while they're saying a similar thing but differently, it's revered as myth or mythology. And I love the fact that, you know, actually when we look at them, they're saying very similar ideas. I think one of the tricky things to understand when we look at that narrative is this idea that time is not a linear offer. It's not an A to B to C consideration, but perhaps one that is cyclic and that sort of does this, where it comes back around to meet the beginning of where it starts. And I love you talking about the idea of something coming out of the darkness, or the Te Kore space, that nothingness in terms of light. Because it wasn't until you just said that I saw it that way, because when I was looking at the works, they were doing the opposite. They were ascending and descending. So that idea that, you know, depending on how you view that potential of, I wish it was up at the moment, of those neon works sort of shuddering off into the distance, or actually coming forth stronger and stronger, is in a very sort of metaphorical way, a way of talking about time as well. Yeah, tell me what's your interest and what's your take on time, Bob? Because I find it's been really, for me it's been a fascinating pondering at the moment when I think about works from people such as Areta Wilkinson and her use of the silhouette of an object, and talking about the notion that it's there when it's not there.
Yeah.
To me, this idea of time is quite sophisticated from a Māori perspective, and is a very layered offer.
Right.
How do you see this notion of time?
Well, I mean, if we look at, we have our word for the past is actually a word that means in front of. So when we talk about the past, we say i ngā rā or mua. So in the days before. So the past, for us as Indigenous people, is actually in front of us as opposed to behind us. And so when we talk about the future, we use a word which means behind. So the future actually is behind us. So we need to see the past in order to progress into the future, which is behind us. So, which is, i ngā rā or muri. So it kind of inverts that notion of front and back, the spatial notion of front and back relative to time. And, I think we have, you might call them strange, but we have these, I call them empowering, but we have these empowering notions of the full potential of being where, and where one's shadow is as potent as, one's body, basically. So the shadow that I cast is all empowering. And we have a lot of historical narratives. On the East Coast where I come from Ngāti Porou, we had an ancestress who was so sacred, like so empowered, that she was carried around on basically a stretcher. So she, if she walked on the earth, she impregnated the earth with so much power that it could kill you. So she had to be born on a stretcher. Not only that, but you had to actually stay out of her shadow. Like when the sun was shining, it would cast the shadow, and the power of that shadow was so strong that you could, it became problematic. And what they had to do was make sure the sun wasn't shining when they carried her around. But, so the culture has all these notions of the extension of the physical being is as powerful as the physical being. And, and the reason for that, if you have a culture that comes up with a concept that you are both a god and a human, you can get a sense of that empowerment that individuals have. And so, this inversion of time in terms of front and back, to me, is quite a significant cultural concept, because we need our ancestors to actually determine where we need to go. We're always looking to the examples that they set, and that becomes the example that leads us forward in time. So there's this revisiting of that, of time, and going back and considering what has gone before, because it's what has gone before determines where we go. So it's it's a cultural notion that I find fascinating. Yeah.
And as you can tell, it's quite involved. So you might be, you can be forgiven for sitting there thinking, what the hell are they talking about? But the layered nature of narrative and its relationship to how we understand and construct time today is really revealing, because a lot of our notions of time are based on our Western paradigm and notions of how we construct the world. So of course, when we have a counter idea to that still endures today, that sort of intersects that, of course it's going to contrast in ways that are going to conflict and make us think twice about how we might understand that. I'm going to just park time for a bit and delve into some of the other interesting elements that are going on in this series of works, Bob.
Yep.
Your works prior to this series could have been described as very powerful black and white text-heavy works And these works are a real departure from that last series, and in a very exciting way, using motif and light and mirrored reflection to create these amazing dimensions. However, they've also been influenced and inspired by other light artists such as Paulo Sherpa and Ivan Navarro, Italian and Antillian artists who, of course, have worked with light in a very similar way. What was it about their work that sort of picked your imagination?
I think what I saw in their work was the potential of a cultural engagement. I mean, as an academic, you know, I teach in a university and I write papers and I'm writing a book, and you know, so I do all these other things besides making art. But one of the things that grabbed me straight away was in their use of light, was the potential for creating or expressing very difficult and very heavy cultural concepts. Now, as far as engaging with that is concerned, people engage in art at the level that they engage in art. You know, I can't determine how people will engage with it or react to it. But one of the things, you know, in terms of my practice over the years, I've deliberately taken iconic symbols. For example, we have Colin McCann, who's here, is famous for, you know, engaging with Cubism. And back in the 50s, he did a painting which was simply I am. So it was I-A-M. And later on, we have a young artist who's actually, well, he's no longer young, but Michael Parekowhai, who has an exhibition in Sydney at the moment, created a work that mimicked in sculptural form the work created by McCann. So it became, but he added H-E, which is a Māori word for error or for wrong, incorrect. So it became I am incorrect. But it became H-E, so I am he. Is he talking about, and that's the great thing about Michael's work, is it's ambiguous. So is the work saying I am he, or is it saying I am the one who's made an error? Because that's what here means in Māori. So later on, I engaged in text work, which appropriated not only McCann, but also Michael Parekowhai, and created a work which is full panel work called I Am He. And then, with Michael's permission, I got hold of one of his sculptures of an Indian and placed it in front of the painting, looking at the painting. So I kind of like that notion of taking this cycle of appropriation that has gone from McCann to Michael and back to me, and re-engaging with that concept of appropriation. And then I created a whole series of works based on the I am. So, and a lot of them had to do with notions of identity. So, for example, there's a work that I created which is called I am a quantum native. And because quantum is really an interesting notion to us as Māori, because we managed to get rid of it so that in New Zealand law, you self-identify as Māori. And I know that, you know, in the past, for example, before I went to the States and continued study in the States, I went to apply for this job as a graphic designer, and it was within a Samoan resource development center. And the person who interviewed me was Samoan, and of course, one of his questions was, do you speak Samoan? And I said, no, I don't. I speak Māori. And he says, why don't you speak Samoan? I said, because I was brought up in a Māori village, and that's where I come from. That's the context of who I am. That place defined who I am. That place defined how I think. That place defines how I engage with culture, with my culture, and with other cultures. So my lens is created by the lens that was polished and defined at that particular period of my life. But anyway, I didn't get the job. in fact, it went to a non-Māori, it went to a Pākehā artist. And I'm going, this seems so contradictory, where here I am as an Indigenous person applying for a job and I don't get it. It goes to, you know, a non-Indigenous person. Anyway, so, but these works were really about the questions of identity. And what I find really peculiar, really strange, is that the quantum measure system still exists in Hawaii, still exists in the States. You know, I mean, you could be an Indian artist, but you've got to actually register to be an Indian artist. How ludicrous is that? And so, you know, I'm sitting here and I say I'm Māori, and then, of course, and I got a T-shirt, of course, which says I'm Māori made. But, you know, when I say I'm Māori, it's because the culture that I identify with, the philosophy that I come from in terms of the way that I think and speak, is one that is Māori. It's not Samoan, it's not German. You know, it would be different if I was brought up in Germany, for example, and speaking Germany. I would be strange. I'd be, you know, a dark German speaking German. It'd be really weird. But, yeah, so I'm Māori. And so these works were really about identity, you know. And I also created a work which has a kind of philosophical base, and it's called I Am a Strategic Essentialist. And for those of you who are aware of kind of postmodern theory and development and post-structuralism, it is a term that was created by Gayatri Spivak. And the whole notion of strategic essentialism is that Indigenous people quite often have to stand up and announce the fact they're Indigenous. I mean, you've got to be proactive about it. And in some other cases, you kind of, you know, you don the cloak or the jacket of essentialism in order to make yourself heard. And at other times, you don't need to do it, so you take it off. You know, so I'm really, if I'm anything, I'm probably a strategic essentialist. So, but, you know, that engagement, I kind of like engaging with a language that pre-exists or a visual language that has been used before, and then taking it, re-engaging it, and having a kind of a transcultural engagement with those motifs and those images. So.
Okay, well, let's talk about those motifs and images, because I think one interesting thing that does endure in your latest work is the use of the cross motif, the use of the clubs, and so forth. How about you just shed some light on the motif?
Let me start with the club, because like when the work was touring in New Zealand, you know, people see this work and they see a neon club and they go, God, that would look really good in a nightclub. And, but the club is actually a significant symbol, which interestingly enough, I used in the very first exhibition that I created, which was also called Ata. And the club is a motif. Obviously, it's a trifoil motif, and it was one that was appropriated by one of our prophets in the Uruweras, and he didn't actually create meeting houses. What he did was he created a roundhouse based on Solomon's temple. And the motifs that he used on the house were the club and a diamond. And so when I take that and put those symbols together, it really is about acknowledging a period in our history when prophets were very essential to actually setting up Māori societies or Māori cultural centres that really empowered a Māori philosophical approach to living and life. So they were kind of, you know, and the colonial government at that time saw them as separatist, communities, and did their best to actually dethrone them. And what happened eventually to Ruakenana is they invaded the Uruwera areas, they basically imprisoned him, they killed his son, and, you know, it just destroyed the community by taking out the leaders. And this has happened so many times when we've had prophets coming up and speaking back, or creating a society that is allowing Māori the freedom to be who they are as a people. So, you know, so there's a historical engagement that I like to kind of reiterate, and I quite often take symbols that I've used from the past and then re-engage with them in a new way.
So, I mean, when I look at the works, we're talking about cosmological narratives and these grand narratives, but we're also talking about our colonial experience at the same time and our experience on the ground. I think before we're going to throw to questions from the audience very shortly, but one last question, Bob. I love the way in which you navigate appropriation or I think the history of it. You know, you talked about Ruakinana and the clubs and the diamonds and how they co-opted these symbols to talk about empowerment from an Indigenous perspective as tools. And you're a very proud appropriator in your own way and in your own sense. But I think appropriation as a debate in a post-colonial sense is being frowned upon or is not widely celebrated, I suppose. Give me your take on appropriation.
I think, appropriation is an interesting thing because, I remember back in the 80s, there was a lot, not the 80s, the 70s, there was a strong political backlash against non-Māori artists taking Māori imagery, and they were being criticised as appropriating. And I think there's two forms of appropriation that exist. There is what I'd call a benign appropriation and a malignant appropriation. Essentially what I'm saying, there's good appropriation and bad appropriation. What needs to happen? I mean, there needs to be, if you're going to use other Indigenous cultures' images, there's two things you need to do. The proper way to do it is to ask the culture if you can use it. But if you don't ask the culture whether you can use it, you really need to be respectful of the images that you use and what they signify within a cultural context. Just to give you one example, we have a pattern which is called a koru, and really it's like a bar with a head on the end of it. And the thing is with that particular symbol, and this is what people need to realize, we don't actually own that. Every culture owns that. I mean, you can find it in Greek culture, you can find it in Egyptian culture, you can find it all over the world. What we do own is the combinations of that particular pattern that generate other patterns. So from a koru, for example, you get a koiri. From a koru, you get a mangopare. Now, those are the patterns we own, not the koru. And so there was a great debate over the work created by Gordon Walters in terms of his appropriation of Māori art. What he was using was a symbol, which was the koru, that we as Māori don't own. So he had every right to do what he did, but he got criticised of appropriating this symbol for Māori. So we don't own that. We've got to be careful as Indigenous people that we know the story of these motifs, we understand what they mean, and we understand the significance of it. So, I mean, as far as appropriation is concerned, I mean, there was another case, a famous case of an artist called Dick Frisell, and he created a show, and he created these paintings, some of which he called Goofy Tiki. Now, we took offence to it because we didn't mind him creating goofy images as long as he didn't call it Goofy Tiki, because what it did, it undermined our ancestral images, which are tiki. And so a lot of Māori at that time took offence to that and reacted to that. He came back and said, well, I got some of these images from buildings around, Auckland. But I can tell you that when you look at the Goofy Tiki, what you're looking at is a really Goofy Tiki. So it's macabre in a sense. So his engagement, and he constantly kind of does that. He goes away, does something else, and he comes back because he's a kind of he's an artist who's a little bit of a sensationalist in a way. But in saying that, he is actually really, really a great artist. And, just sometimes he kind of just crosses the line culturally. So, yeah.
Thank you, Bob. We're going to cross the line now and ask for questions from the audience. So, feel free. If there's anything in those creation stories that has intrigued you or that you want to ask questions about, questions full stop, please feel free. We have a microphone in.
Bob, you were talking earlier about extensions of the body having the same power that the body has. So this divine sort of godly part that is in every one of us.
Right.
So I wanted to ask you if you consider your artworks to be extensions of your body, and if you think they carry some of that godly and human power.
Now, did you hear that?
Yeah.
Could you pass it on? Sorry.
Do you think that extension of ira tangata, ira atua, that you have essentially in your being, does it extend to the artworks that you create?
As I said, everything has a motive, right? So what I can say to you is that the material that I work with has a motive. And so by putting electricity in it, in a sense, what you're doing is kind of charging it with an essence that every life thing, it's like the act of empowering this notion, of godliness and humanness within these inanimate things. I mean, it's a really hard thing to kind of understand, but it's, for the humans to exist, I can say that's got a motive, but it does not have this notion of the ira tangata and the ira atua, because it can't, because it's not human. It's an alternative. It's an what is the word? It's inorganic. It's it's not human, but it can have motive, and that's the essence. Yeah. A tree has motive, right? But a tree is not human, so a tree can't have both those essences of human and deity. It can have the element of deity, but not of humanness. So, so it's a concept which is only exists within people. And when you, as I say, when you die, the only thing that remains is the godly essence. And we talk about, within Western traditions, you talk about the spirit, right? We have a notion of a wairua, which is that essence, that spirit that journeys to another place, another reality, or back to Te Po. So, it's a little bit different, but it does have motive. This couch has motive, so does that screen over there, This has motive. Something as basic as that has motive in it. Everything's got motive.
Sorry to come back, but my question was actually, if you consider your artworks an extension of your body.
Oh, yes.
Like the shadow of the ancestor.
Yes, it is, because I physically touch it. So in touching it, in making it, engaging with it, it has me in it. Right? Anything you wear, right, has your essence. So, same concept of the shadow and, Yes?
Hi, Bob.
Hi.
It seems that a lot of these concepts that you've touched on border heavily on philosophical and scientific understandings that have quite interesting translations into forms of Western philosophy that are perhaps not so mainstream in certain contexts. I found profound resonances in it beyond even post-structuralism, perhaps going back to Hegel, for example. So referring to this concept of strategic essentialism that you mentioned, do you ever engage, I'd rather like to hear about instances where you engage in conversations around philosophy and science and so on, where you actually drop those strategic essentialisms and you don't say, as a Maori person who's sort of engaged with these beliefs throughout my life, but rather, this is how I think the world works. And how does that conversation go? I'm curious.
Okay, just before I'll get Nigel to pass that on to me. One of the things as an artist, unfortunately, is that working all these years as an artist, I'm actually almost deaf. So I have to get Nigel to pass your question on to me. Sorry. Okay.
Well, I got the last one that I tried to translate wrong. So maybe I think what the chap is asking is when you're talking about these ideas philosophically,
Yep.
Are you able to drop the Māori framing of them to just let them be philosophical conversations?
Right.
Would that be right?
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah.
And I think I mean, Bob's going to answer that question, but I think, context is everything. So if I'm having a conversation with Bob, we'll drop all that because we know that we know the context of what we're discussing. But when you're talking across philosophies, you have to have a way into having some mediatorial space where things exist in with clarity without having to explain. And I'm not sure that they do unless you do find where those similarities lie. But Bob, that's your question. That's your question.
I think, that's an interesting question. It's, it's kind of like, let me put it another way. I'll just tell you a story which kind of has an element of, which will kind of give you an idea of how I engage in things and how I think, what shapes me and what makes me do the things I do. A few years ago, I went, basically I embellished my tribal house on the East Coast. So the first thing we did was we did murals for the dining room and I did the back wall of my meeting house. And what I did in creating those images for the back wall of the meeting house is I made them sexually explicit. And the reason I did that was because as a researcher, I'd uncovered the existence of these images in houses, certain houses around the country. And I kind of wanted to reinvest this imagery again, bring it to the attention of my iwi, or my people back home. And what happened was, the people around my village came up with an expression which was really about our house. And it said, essentially in English, it said, this is, that is a small house that's got a big mouth. And what they were essentially saying in terms of the big mouth was, we were blowing things out of proportion in terms of symbolism. And so I had to go back and meet with my elders, right, and to discuss this. Now, I went back there and I was going to say to them, I'm going to educate you. And basically, your problem is you've been indoctrinated, you've been converted to Christianity, you've been indoctrinated into thinking that this is not the way it should be. So here I am going with my, researcher hat, my philosophical point of view. I walked out of there and they won. So I had to go back and take the carvings down that went from the floor to the ceiling, and I made them smaller. So I had to actually eat humble pie because they are the ones that look after the house. They are the ones that live in the house. They are the ones that feed people when they come to the house. I'm only a visitor. So I lost that, it's not that I lost that battle, it made me realize I need to take off this artistic kind of hat that I was wearing and throw it away. And ever since that time, I have to be very careful how I engage when I go into the community. And then years later, I finished the house, and then I had a student of mine help me carve it, did the outside of the house, and I painted it blue. Now, all houses where I come from are red. This is that sacred color that I was talking about. And I had to go home again because I'd crossed the line again. But this time I was able to say to them, they gave me an opportunity to defend myself. And the reason I painted it blue is the ancestor who built the house was innovative in terms of using naturalistic painting, and his favorite color was green. Like he would paint our patterns green instead of red, black, and white. But we also have an origin a narrative of carving coming from the sea. And not only that, we also have a traditional clay which is called tutai fetu. And tutai fetu is star excrement, so it's a very significant clay or significant color. And they listened to me, and the great thing about it was the speaker who closed it was an elder, and his name was Tommy Tomtomaro, but his nickname was Tommy Blue. And he stood up at the end and he said, in Māori, blue is the sky, blue is the sea, blue is the house, blue is me. And that ended everything. But it took this, it went from philosophy to being really, really kind of, human engagement and listening to each other and considering, the whole context. Now, that house is so unique that the people of my village go around and proudly announce this proverb, which is in Māori. And it goes, kiko rangi te rangi, kiko rangi te moana, kiko rangi te whare, kiko rangi te tangata. So, I ended with that.
I hope that answered the question.
In a roundabout way, it probably did.
Any last questions? One up there.
Thanks for Thanks for sharing the nuanced and enriched understandings of your culture and the way it's transmitted through your artwork. I've got a question which is more about the materials. I'm wondering if the use of light and neon is underselling the richness of your culture. I'm concerned that you've appropriated that perhaps from a Western tradition, particularly the US, and more importantly, the sensitivities and nuances of the meanings that you wish to communicate in terms of Māori tradition are possibly being lost and overwhelmed with the white noise, if I can put it that way, that neon represents in Western society. Are you satisfied with your use and choice of neon as a medium?
No.
Okay, I'm just going to translate because I didn't realise you were deaf, Bob,
right.
but the speakers are facing that way, by the way.
Yeah.
So basically,
yep.
He's asking that the neon has its own history, if you like,
yeah.
in the West and in America.
Yeah.
You're going to have to help me here.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think, well, that's it. In other words, you're saying, why am I not creating art that is grounded in the culture? Yeah. I think, that's an interesting point. It's kind of, I exist in the 21st century, and what I do is I engage as a Māori with 21st century technology. As an artist, I mean, I have, and it's what is particularly interesting, I think, if you track through the work that I've done over the years, I have deliberately created work that has no cultural reference at all, right? So, for example, when I'm creating text work, apart from the fact that I might use a word like Māori, but it's been totally non-referential in terms of visual symbols. Now, this body of work is slightly different to that because what I've done is taken work that Māori identify as Māori, or symbols that Māori identify as Māori. So it's kind of creating work that the culture can engage with. And it's the first body of work that I've done like that apart from my meeting house, right? And why have I done that? What I've come to realize in my practice is that I've been pushing this non-customary boat, and engaging in creating work that is not visibly Māori. And for what reason? And I've kind of stepped back. It's kind of like the meeting house story. I've kind of stepped back and re-looked at what I've been doing and looked at what other artists are doing and saying, look, I'm 67 years old. I don't care anymore. Like, I can do what I want, whether I'm using timber or neons or whatever it may be. I need to kind of...
You didn't care 20 years ago either, though.
Well, that was a different kind of caring. But you know what I mean. So see, I basically, as a researcher, as a historian, as an intellectual, I've created a paradigm when I look at Māori art. And today, Māori art, there are three forms of Māori art that exist simultaneously. There is customary, trans-customary, and non-customary. And trans-customary is where you engage with motif or symbol in new medium, and you take it and you reconfigure it. Most of the work that I've created over my artistic career has been non-customary. In other words, you can't see Māori in it. And it's recently that I've come to create work where Māori see themselves in the work. So I hope that answers your question. I think that's sort of where you were going. Right, okay, right.
I think we're up.
Yep, time's up.
And thank you everyone for coming. Kia ora, Bob.
Thank you.